I am Clara, 33 years old, and a senior partner in mergers and acquisitions at one of Boston's most ruthless investment firms. But 15 years ago, I was just a sick teenager, freezing to death in a snowbank. "You cannot be here," my father stammered, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his luxury briefcase. He was staring at the reclusive billionaire sitting quietly next to my hospital bed. The billionaire did not blink. He just looked at my father with absolute disgust. That was the exact moment my father's real estate empire started its countdown to absolute zero. Before I tell you how I bought my family's entire legacy for a single dollar bill, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever used your success to crush the people who threw you away. Growing up in our pristine Massachusetts suburb, I learned early that in the Richard and Patricia household, you were only as valuable as your return on investment. I was a terrible investment. I suffered from mild chronic pneumonia. While other kids got chicken soup and sympathy, my parents treated my medical bills like a personal insult to their bottom line. I was constantly reminded that my inhalers and doctor visits were draining resources that belonged to my older sister, Brittany. Brittany was 20 years old, a pre-med student with perfect blonde hair and an insatiable appetite for designer brands. She was the golden child. She was the one destined to marry a surgeon and elevate our family's country club status. I was just the medical liability. On the night of the worst snowstorm of the decade, the facade of our perfect family cracked. I was in my room running a fever of 102 degrees when I heard screaming from my father's home office. I crept to the top of the stairs. My father was holding a stack of bank statements, his face purple with rage. $15,000 was missing from the family business safe. Brittany stood cornered by the mahogany desk. She had secretly maxed out 3 credit cards on luxury vacations and designer handbags to impress her wealthy college friends. When she could not make the minimum payments, she helped herself to the company safe. But my sister was nothing, if not a brilliant manipulator. As my father demanded answers, Brittany burst into fake hysterical tears. She pointed a manicured finger directly up the stairs at me. She told them she caught me stealing the money. She claimed I was buying illegal drugs to cope with my chronic illness. I froze on the staircase, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I stumbled down the steps begging them to look at my bank accounts. I told them to search my room to drug test me right then and there. I did not even have a driver's license, let alone a drug dealer. But Brittany had prepared for this exact moment. She ran up to my room and pulled a thick wad of $100 bills from under my mattress. She had planted the remaining stolen cash exactly where she knew they would look. My mother, Patricia, did not hesitate. She did not ask for my side of the story. She walked into my bedroom, grabbed a black plastic garbage bag, and started shoving my clothes inside. I fell to my knees in the hallway, pleading with my father. I offered to pull up my banking app. I offered to call the police myself to do a forensic investigation on the missing funds. My father slapped the phone out of my hand. The device shattered against the hardwood floor, cutting off my only lifeline to the outside world. Outside, the storm was howling. The local news had warned everyone to stay indoors. The roads were already buried under 2 feet of snow, and the temperature was dropping into the single digits. My mother dragged me by my sweater and shoved me toward the front door, throwing the plastic garbage bag onto the frozen porch. I was wearing nothing but thin pajama pants and a light cardigan. I was practically choking on my own infected lungs. My father stood in the warm, brightly lit foyer. He looked down at me with cold, dead eyes. "Get out," he said, his voice completely devoid of any parental warmth. "I do not need a sick daughter ruining Brittany's medical school future. We are done paying for your mistakes. Do not ever show your face at this house again." He slammed the heavy oak door. I heard the deadbolt click into place. I stood barefoot on the icy wood of the porch, the freezing wind ripping right through my thin clothes. I pounded on the door until my knuckles bled, begging them to at least let me get my winter coat or my emergency inhaler. The only response was the sound of the television turning up in the living room. They were settling in for a cozy movie night while their 18-year-old daughter was left outside to die. I looked through the living room window. Brittany was sitting on the expensive leather sofa sipping hot cocoa. She met my eyes through the frost-covered glass and smiled. It was a cold, calculated smirk. She had secured her financial lifeline by severing mine. In that freezing darkness, shivering violently and struggling to breathe, the crying stopped. I realized crying was a sunk cost. I turned my back on the house that was never a home. I left my garbage bag of clothes on the porch and began to walk into the whiteout conditions. I did not know it yet, but every freezing step I took away from that driveway was a step closer to destroying everything my father had ever built. The snow was not just falling, it was attacking. Every gust of wind felt like shards of glass tearing at my exposed skin. I had no coat, no gloves, and no phone. The thin cotton of my pajamas offered zero protection against the historic New England nor'easter currently burying the state. My lungs, already tight from chronic pneumonia, burned with every desperate breath I took. The fever that had kept me bedridden just hours ago now raged against the freezing temperature outside, turning my body into a chaotic battleground of extreme heat and biting cold. I could not feel my toes. Within the first 10 minutes, my bare feet had gone completely numb, transforming into heavy blocks of ice that I had to drag through the deepening drifts. I knew the geography of our town well. The police station was nearly 4 miles away, situated just past the ultra-wealthy district where the sprawling estates of local tycoons sat behind towering iron gates. That was my only goal. 4 miles. If I stopped moving, I would die. It was a simple, brutal calculation. I wrapped my thin cardigan tighter around my chest, crossing my arms over my burning lungs, and forced my frozen legs to keep moving forward. The suburban streets were completely deserted. No plows, no passing cars, no good Samaritans peering out their windows. The blackout conditions made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. My mind started playing cruel tricks on me as the hypothermia set in. I imagined I was back in my warm bed, the fever making me hallucinate the smell of hot tea. Then a violent coughing fit would rip me back to reality. I doubled over in the snow, coughing so hard I tasted blood in the back of my throat. The infection in my lungs was spreading rapidly, accelerated by the brutal cold. I forced myself upright again. I could not let Brittany win. I could not let my parents' cruel betrayal be the final chapter of my life. Anger became my fuel. It burned hotter than the fever. I pictured my father's dead eyes. I remembered my mother packing my clothes in a trash bag. That rage kept my heart beating as the snow climbed past my ankles. After an eternity of walking, the landscape began to change. The modest suburban homes gave way to massive stone walls and wrought iron fencing. I had reached the wealthy district. The streetlights here were brighter, illuminating the sheer volume of snow that had accumulated. Some of these mansions had backup generators, their warm golden lights glowing behind thick frosted windows. Inside those walls, people were safe. They were drinking wine and watching the storm on massive televisions. Out here on the street, I was actively dying. The contrast was a physical ache in my chest. I tried to shout for help, hoping a security guard or a late-night caretaker might hear me over the howling wind. But when I opened my mouth, the only sound that escaped was a weak, rattling wheeze. My vocal cords were frozen. My vision began blurring at the edges, darkening into a tunnel. The pain in my chest evolved into a heavy, crushing weight, as if a concrete block had been placed directly over my heart. The hypothermia was reaching its final fatal stages. A strange, terrifying warmth suddenly flooded my body, a physiological trick my brain played as my core temperature dropped to critical levels. The snowbanks started looking incredibly inviting. I just needed to rest for 1 minute, just 60 seconds to catch my breath before continuing to the police station. My knees buckled. I did not try to catch myself. I pitched forward, collapsing face first into a massive snowdrift beside a towering stone mailbox. The snow enveloped me like a freezing blanket. I could not move my arms or legs. The howling wind faded into a dull roar. I was losing consciousness. I knew I was dying right there on the sidewalk. Through the fading darkness, a blinding white light suddenly pierced my closing eyelids. A deep mechanical rumbling vibrated through the snow beneath my cheek. It was an engine, a massive, powerful engine. Tires crunched heavily through the deep powder, stopping just inches from my frozen body. Two car doors slammed shut. I heard heavy boots hitting the pavement. "Boss, over here! We have a body in the snowbank!" A rough, urgent voice shouted over the wind. Footsteps rushed toward me. Strong gloved hands gripped my shoulders and rolled me onto my back. I forced my eyes open a tiny fraction. Looming over me was a man in a thick cashmere overcoat. He had sharp, piercing eyes and an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. I did not know it then, but this was Donovan Reed, the billionaire investment tycoon, a man who valued privacy above all else, yet here he was kneeling in the freezing sludge. "She is barely breathing," Donovan commanded, his voice slicing through the storm with absolute precision. "Her core temperature is critical. Forget the ambulance, they will never make it through this snow. Get her in the SUV right now. We are taking her to my private medical facility." Strong arms lifted me from the snowbank. The immediate warmth of the armored vehicle interior wrapped around me as I was laid carefully across the heated leather seats. I felt a thick woolen blanket being thrown over my shivering body. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing out the deadly storm. Donovan Reed looked down at me from the front seat, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. As the armored SUV accelerated through the blizzard, my eyes finally rolled back, and I surrendered entirely to the darkness. I drifted back into consciousness through a haze of sterile warmth and the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors. My eyes fluttered open to a blinding white ceiling. I was no longer freezing. Heated blankets engulfed my body. An oxygen mask pushed warm air into my scarred lungs. An intravenous line fed a steady stream of fluids and high-grade antibiotics directly into my vein. I shifted my head slightly, taking in the sheer opulence of the room. The walls were lined with cherry wood paneling, and the medical equipment was hidden behind sleek, frosted glass cabinets. It looked like a five-star hotel suite that happened to double as a trauma center. Sitting in a leather armchair by the window was Donovan Reed. He was speaking quietly into a secure satellite phone, his posture rigid and commanding. He caught my movement and ended the call immediately. The clock on the cherrywood wall read 3 in the morning. Exactly 4 hours had passed since I collapsed in that snowbank. A team of elite private physicians had spent those 4 hours stabilizing my core temperature and attacking the severe pneumonia drowning my lungs. Donovan stood up and walked over to the bed. His expression was sharp, analyzing my vitals on the monitor with the cold precision of a man who dealt in numbers and probabilities. He offered no empty platitudes or fake sympathy. "Drink this slowly," he commanded, handing me a glass of warm water. "You survived the hypothermia, but your lungs are severely compromised. The hospital administration had to run your fingerprints to pull your medical history. Because you are technically 18, but still listed as a dependent on your father's insurance, the local precinct was legally obligated to notify your next of kin. They are on their way up now." My heart rate monitor instantly spiked, the frantic beeping echoing through the quiet suite. The heavy wooden door to the VIP suite swung open with a violent thud. Richard and Patricia stormed into the room, bringing the bitter chill of the winter storm in with them. They had not come out of concern. They had come out of sheer, unadulterated anger. My mother was clutching her designer handbag like a weapon, her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. My father marched right past the elite nursing staff, his eyes locked on me with absolute fury. "Clara, what the hell is wrong with you?" my father hissed, keeping his voice in a harsh whisper to avoid drawing attention from the hallway. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to get a call from the police at 3 in the morning? We had to leave Brittany alone at the house just to deal with your latest stunt." My mother stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over the luxurious room with a mixture of confusion and intense disdain. "You just had to make a scene, did you not?" she sneered. "Running away in a blizzard just because you got caught stealing from your own family? You are a complete embarrassment to the family name. The police told us you were found nearly dead on the sidewalk. You realize how this looks for your father's business. If the country club finds out you were wandering the streets like a vagrant, our reputation will be ruined. Get your clothes on right now. We are taking you home and you are going to apologize to your sister for the trauma you caused her tonight. I stared at them, the oxygen mask still strapped to my face. I could barely breathe, let alone speak. They did not ask a single medical question. They did not ask if I was in pain. They only cared about the optics of having a police cruiser show up at their pristine suburban driveway. My father reached forward to grab my arm fully, intending to drag me out of the hospital bed by force. He never made contact. A large hand clamped down on his wrist with the force of a steel vice. Donovan Reed stepped out from the shadows of the window alcove, his presence instantly dominating the room. "Remove your hand from my patient," Donovan said, his voice dropping an octave into a lethal whisper. My father ripped his arm away, ready to unleash a tirade of wealthy suburban entitlement. "Do you know who I am?" my father barked, adjusting his suit jacket. "I am Richard." The words died in his throat. The arrogant flush of anger drained entirely from his face, replaced by a sickening, chalky white pallor. His eyes widened as they locked onto Donovan's face. The swagger evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out shell of a man. He recognized the billionaire standing before him. Everyone in the high-stakes commercial real estate world knew Donovan Reed, but my father knew him for a very specific, terrifying reason. Richard's real estate firm was bleeding cash. To maintain his country club lifestyle and keep up appearances, he had taken out a massive $5 million mezzanine debt loan to keep his flagship development project afloat. That loan was held by a shadowy private equity firm. The ultimate beneficiary and owner of that firm was Donovan Reed. My father was staring directly at the man who held the absolute power to liquidate his entire life's work with a single phone call. "Mr. Reed," my father stammered, his voice cracking violently. "I had no idea. I mean, what are you doing here?" Donovan did not shout. Men with real power never need to raise their voices. He simply looked at my father as if analyzing a bad investment on a balance sheet. "You threw away a diamond because you thought it was glass," Donovan said, his tone razor-sharp and devoid of any mercy. "I will be the one cutting it." My mother, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hovering over her husband's neck, crossed her arms. "Excuse me," she snapped. "This is a family matter. We are taking our daughter home." "You are not taking anyone anywhere," Donovan replied coldly. He pressed a button on the wall. Two massive private security contractors stepped into the room, flanking the doorway. "Clara is 18 years old. She is legally an adult. She has just signed a medical proxy transferring all her healthcare decisions to my legal team. Your insurance is no longer required, and your presence is a hazard to her recovery." My father grabbed my mother's arm, his fingers digging into her expensive coat to silence her. "Clara," he pleaded, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes. "Come home. We can fix this." I reached up and pulled the oxygen mask down from my face. I looked at the man who had locked me out in a blizzard to protect a thief. "I am not going anywhere with you," I said, my voice raspy but resolute. "You told me never to show my face at your house again. I am simply honoring your request." My father opened his mouth to argue, but Donovan cut him off. "You heard the lady," Donovan said. "Get out." The security guards took a step forward. My father grabbed my mother and practically dragged her out of the VIP suite, fleeing from the man who owned his debt. I leaned back against the pillows, the monitors finally settling into a steady, calm rhythm. The first boundary had been drawn. The bridge was burned. As I watched the heart rate lines spike and dip on the digital screen beside me, I stopped feeling like a victim. I started viewing my life the same way Donovan Reed viewed his portfolios. Every liability had to be cut. Every asset had to be leveraged. My family was a bankrupt enterprise, and I was officially closing the account. I was ready to build an empire on the ashes. 15 years is a long time to hold a grudge, but it is the perfect amount of time to sharpen a weapon. I am 33 years old now. I do not cry over the past, and I certainly do not wait for apologies that will never come. I learned the most valuable lesson of my life in that VIP hospital bed, while the cardiac monitors beeped in the background. Blood does not make a family. Blood is just a biological coincidence, a genetic accident that society uses to force loyalty where none is deserved. Financial independence is the only impenetrable armor in this world. When you control the capital, you control the narrative. I dropped my father's surname the second the legal paperwork could be processed. I became Clara Reed. Donovan did not just pay for my recovery and my education. He forged me in his image. He taught me how to read a balance sheet like a homicide detective reads a crime scene. He taught me how to find the lies hidden in the margins. The heavy oak doors of the downtown Boston boardroom swung shut, sealing out the chaotic noise of the trading floor outside. I sat at the head of the polished glass table, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. Sitting across from me was Gregory Thorne, the CEO of a mid-tier logistics company my firm was aggressively looking to acquire. He was sweating right through his expensive silk shirt. He thought he was dealing with a standard merger and acquisition team. He thought his cooked books and inflated revenue projections were clever enough to fool us. He did not realize Donovan Reed had sent his senior partner. He did not know he was sitting across from a forensic accounting sniper. Your EBITDA projections for the third quarter are fascinating, Mr. Thorne, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I tapped my expensive fountain pen against the pristine leather folio on the desk. You show a 20% year-over-year growth. Your profit margins look spectacular on paper. Your shareholders must be thrilled with these quarterly reports. You painted a very pretty picture for our analysts. Thorne puffed out his chest, attempting to project the alpha male confidence he had probably used to intimidate his own board of directors for years. Our logistics network is expanding rapidly, Clara. We have streamlined operations and drastically cut overhead. The valuation we are asking for is completely justified by these numbers. My team spent weeks preparing these documents for Reed Capital. We are offering you a goldmine. I slid a single manila folder across the smooth glass table. It stopped exactly 1 inch from his coffee cup. I did not look at his team of panicked corporate lawyers. I kept my eyes locked directly on Thorne. I spent 4 hours last night reviewing your documents, I replied, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You did not cut overhead. You offloaded your operational liabilities into 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. You then leased your own equipment back to your primary corporation at artificially deflated rates to temporarily boost your cash flow. It is a classic synthetic lease manipulation. Thorne went completely pale. His lead attorney shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair, suddenly refusing to make eye contact with anyone. But that is not the part that offends me. I continued, leaning forward slightly to invade his space. What offends me is the amateur execution. You routed the payments through a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands to avoid federal corporate tax. You are carrying $8 million in hidden debt that you deliberately kept off the main ledger. You are attempting to sell a sinking ship to my firm while simultaneously committing federal tax evasion. Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the ceiling vents. Here is what is going to happen, I stated, opening my own file. I am retracting our initial offer of $50 million. Your company is functionally insolvent. I am offering you $12 million for the raw assets and the client list. My firm will assume the $8 million in hidden debt to keep the Internal Revenue Service from knocking down your front door and throwing you in a federal penitentiary. You will step down as CEO effective immediately. You will sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, and you will walk away with a fraction of your dignity intact. You cannot do this, Thorne sputtered, slamming his fist on the table in a desperate display of weakness. That is highway robbery. We have other buyers lined up. We will walk away from this table right now. Call them, I challenged, gesturing toward the conference room phone. Call them right now. Tell them Clara Reed from Reed Capital just flagged your balance sheets for synthetic lease manipulation and federal tax evasion. Let us see how fast those other buyers run for the hills. You have exactly 3 minutes to sign this contract before I withdraw the offer entirely and send my forensic audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Thorne stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. He recognized that he had been completely outmaneuvered. He reached for the pen with a trembling hand and signed the document, signing away his company for pennies on the dollar. He had tried to cheat the system, and the system had crushed him. As his legal team hurriedly packed their briefcases and ushered their ruined client out of the boardroom, I remained seated at the head of the table. I neatly stacked the freshly signed acquisition papers. This was my everyday reality. I did not rely on luck. I relied on data leverage and ruthless execution. Over the past 15 years, I had clawed my way up the corporate ladder with an obsession that terrified my competitors. I graduated top of my class. I secured my CPA license. I devoured every piece of corporate law and financial strategy Donovan placed in front of me. I became his most trusted weapon. When you have had everything stripped away from you in the middle of a blizzard, you learn to build a fortress that no one can ever breach. Money is not just currency. Money is a weapon. It is the power to say no. It is the power to dictate terms. It is the power to ensure that no one can ever lock you out in the cold again. I built my fortress brick by brick, dollar by dollar, acquisition by acquisition. I was safe. I was untouchable. My phone buzzed on the glass table, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Human Resources regarding a new hire for my division. We were bringing on a new senior auditor to help handle the massive influx of corporate acquisitions my team was processing. I needed someone sharp, someone who could keep up with my grueling pace and match my obsession with financial perfection. I packed the Thorne acquisition files into my briefcase, ready to return to my executive office to review the new candidate. I had an empire to run, and I had no time for incompetence. I walked out of the glass boardroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The past was dead and buried in the snow, or so I thought. The Human Resources file waiting on my mahogany desk was thick, detailed, and flawless. I sat down, opened the crisp manila folder, and reviewed the credentials of our newest candidate for the senior auditor position. His resume was a masterclass in professional achievement. A Master of Science in Accounting, dual certifications in forensic analysis, and a track record of dismantling corporate fraud at a rival firm. His name was Jamal. 10 minutes later, Jamal walked into my executive office. He was a tall, sharply dressed African-American man who carried himself with a quiet, undeniable authority. His charcoal suit was tailored perfectly, though I noticed the faint fraying at the edges of his leather briefcase, the kind of wear and tear that only comes from someone who works 100-hour weeks without complaining. He sat across from me, his posture rigid and professional. I do not believe in standard interviews. I believe in pressure tests. I slid a bound ledger across the desk. It was a dummy file I used to weed out incompetent candidates, containing a heavily disguised tax evasion scheme involving phantom inventory. I gave him a red pen and told him he had 15 minutes to find the anomaly. Jamal did not flinch. He opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers with lethal precision. The room was completely silent, except for the scratch of his pen against the paper. Exactly 8 minutes later, he closed the folder and slid it back to me. He had circled 3 seemingly unrelated equipment depreciation entries and tied them directly to a ghost subsidiary. They are depreciating assets that do not exist to offset their capital gains, Jamal stated, his voice calm and authoritative. It is a sloppy attempt at a phantom asset write-off. If you acquire this company, the federal regulators will audit your entire division within 6 months. I looked at the circled numbers, then back at him. You are hired, I said. Your desk is right outside mine. We have a lot of work to do. Over the next 3 weeks, Jamal proved to be the most formidable auditor I had ever worked with. He was a machine processing complex financial data with a ruthless efficiency that matched my own. We were currently handling the acquisition of a massive telecommunications conglomerate, a nightmare of a deal involving dozens of offshore accounts and questionable vendor contracts. It was a rainy Tuesday night. The rest of the firm had emptied out hours ago, leaving the two of us alone in the glass-walled executive suite. The glowing skyline of Boston reflected against the rain-streaked windows. The only sounds were the hum of the ventilation system and the rapid clicking of our keyboards. I glanced over at Jamal. He was staring at his dual monitors, his jaw clenched tight. He looked dead on his feet. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened significantly since his first day. He was running on pure adrenaline and stale break room coffee, reviewing a particularly messy series of international wire transfers. This telecommunications CEO is trying to hide his personal expenses inside his marketing budget, Jamal said, disgusted. He classified a $200,000 yacht rental as a corporate team building retreat. He expects us to just sign off on this garbage, flag it and deduct it from the final purchase price, I commanded, not looking up from my own spreadsheet, and flag him for a compliance violation. Already done, Jamal replied. I do not sign my name to lies. Numbers are supposed to mean something. They are the only thing in this world that actually tell the complete truth. I stopped typing and looked at him. I had never heard anyone else articulate my exact philosophy with such conviction. People lie. People manipulate people. Rewrite history to suit their own selfish needs. But a balance sheet is an absolute reality. A debit is a debit. A credit is a credit. You cannot gaslight a spreadsheet. Jamal possessed an unshakable moral compass, a rare trait in the cutthroat world of corporate finance. You look like you are going to collapse, Jamal, I noted, closing my laptop. It is past midnight. Go home. The telecommunications deal will still be here tomorrow morning. He rubbed his temples, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. I am fine, Clara. I need the overtime bonus on this acquisition. I am not leaving until this audit is bulletproof. I ordered Thai takeout, and we spent the next hour eating at the conference table surrounded by stacks of financial disclosures. It was the first time we had taken a break from the relentless grind. As we ate, the professional armor cracked just a fraction. You are the highest paid senior auditor in this division, I pointed out casually, taking a sip of water. Why are you working yourself into an early grave for an overtime bonus? Jamal offered a tight, humorless smile. He stared out at the rainy city skyline, his expression heavy with a burden he was clearly trying to carry all by himself. Personal financial restructuring, he said quietly, choosing his words with immense care to maintain his professionalism. My wife and I have different definitions of financial security. He paused, tapping his chopsticks against the cardboard takeout container. She grew up with a certain lifestyle and she believes credit limits are merely suggestions. She recently made some significant purchases without consulting me. The debt is piling up faster than I can pay it down. But I am the provider. It is my responsibility to fix it. I will work around the clock if I have to. I watched him closely. I saw the quiet desperation in his eyes, the crushing weight of a man trying to bail out a sinking ship with a bucket. He was honorable to a fault, taking on the burden of his wife's reckless greed because he believed in duty and family. He did not name her. He did not launch into an emotional tirade. He just stated the facts, treating his ruined personal finances like another audit that needed his immediate attention. I respected him immensely in that moment. I knew exactly what it was like to be anchored to toxic, parasitic people who drained your resources and demanded you apologize for not giving them more. I did not offer him empty pity. I offered him the only thing that mattered in our world. Finish the audit by Thursday, I told him, standing up to clear the table. If you find every single hidden liability in their books, I will personally ensure your acquisition bonus is doubled. We reward actual hard work in this firm. Jamal looked at me, genuine gratitude breaking through his exhaustion. Thank you, Clara. I will not let you down. He turned back to his monitors, his focus renewed. I walked back to my office, impressed by his sheer determination. I had found a brilliant, loyal ally in Jamal. He was a man of absolute integrity who was currently being bled dry by a selfish, careless wife. I felt a pang of sympathy for him, completely unaware that the financial parasite ruining his life was a monster I knew intimately. The next morning arrived with the sharp clarity that always follows a closed deal. Jamal had delivered the finalized audit for the telecommunications acquisition by 8 in the morning, precisely as promised. I reviewed his findings over my morning espresso. The report was an absolute masterpiece of forensic accounting. He had dismantled the corrupt executive's financial labyrinth with surgical precision, saving our firm millions in hidden liabilities. I grabbed the physical file intending to personally deliver his authorization for the doubled bonus. I walked out of my executive suite and approached his desk. Jamal was on a phone call, his tone hushed and strained, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I stood at the threshold of his cubicle, waiting for him to finish. That was when my eyes drifted to the small silver picture frame, positioned neatly next to his dual monitors. My breath caught in my throat. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. Staring back at me from the glossy photograph was Jamal, looking genuinely happy, holding a toddler in his arms. Next to him stood a young boy with Jamal's eyes. And standing directly behind them, with her arms wrapped possessively around Jamal's shoulders, was my sister, Brittany. She looked exactly the same as she had 15 years ago, just polished with the expensive gloss of adult wealth. The perfect blonde hair, the perfectly manufactured smile, the designer dress that probably cost more than Jamal's monthly salary. The golden child. The thief who had framed me. The monster who had smiled through the frosted glass window while I froze in the snow. The universe has a twisted sense of humor. The brilliant principled auditor sitting in front of me, the man working 100-hour weeks to pay off his wife's reckless credit card debt, was married to the very parasite who had destroyed my teenage life. Jamal was being bled dry by my sister. Jamal ended his phone call with a heavy sigh and looked up, startled to see me standing there. I forced my facial muscles to remain completely relaxed. I am a senior partner in mergers and acquisitions. I negotiate with ruthless billionaires for a living. I did not let a single ounce of shock register on my face. My expression remained a mask of absolute corporate ice. Excellent work on the telecommunications audit, Jamal. I said, my voice steady and commanding. I slid the authorized bonus paperwork onto his desk, deliberately placing it right next to the silver picture frame. Your bonus has been doubled and expedited. It will hit your account by Friday. Take the rest of the day off. Go home to your family. Jamal looked at the paperwork, a wave of profound relief washing over his exhausted features. Thank you, Clara, he said earnestly. You have no idea what this means for us. I know exactly what it means, I replied smoothly. Enjoy the weekend. I turned on my heel and walked back to my office, my strides measured and deliberate. I closed my heavy oak door and locked it. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the Boston skyline. My hands were perfectly still. I was not angry. I was not triggered by the trauma of my past. I felt an overwhelming sense of predatory focus. The pieces on the chessboard were suddenly aligning in a way I could have never orchestrated myself. If Brittany was draining Jamal's bank accounts, it meant her primary source of funding had dried up. Brittany would never rely on a hardworking auditor's salary unless she had absolutely no other choice. My parents had always funded her lavish lifestyle. They had paid for her luxury cars, her expensive vacations, and her endless shopping sprees. If she was drowning her husband in debt, it meant Richard and Patricia had closed the bank of Mom and Dad. And Richard and Patricia only closed the bank when the vault was completely empty. I sat down at my desk and booted up my secure terminal. I bypassed the standard firm network and logged directly into our advanced forensic accounting software. I typed in the name of my father's commercial real estate company. I had not checked on his business in over a decade. I had been too focused on building my own empire to care about his. But now I needed to know the exact status of the enemy. I pulled the public financial records. I requested the municipal property tax filings. I ran a comprehensive background check on their corporate entity through our proprietary database. The data flooded my screens, rows and columns of raw, unfiltered financial truth. I spent the next 3 hours dissecting my father's life work. It was a financial massacre. Richard's real estate empire was not just struggling, it was actively bleeding to death. The balance sheets were a disaster of gross mismanagement and desperate loans. He had leveraged his prime commercial properties to the absolute limit, taking out high-interest loans to cover the operational deficits. The company was drowning in negative cash flow. But the most damning evidence was hiding in the federal tax records. I pulled up the lien registry. Richard had not paid his corporate payroll taxes in 18 months. The Internal Revenue Service had already issued 3 separate tax liens against his primary corporate entity. He owed millions to the federal government. You can negotiate with private creditors, but you cannot negotiate with the IRS when you steal from your own employees. The company was functionally insolvent. They were hovering on the absolute brink of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. One stiff breeze would knock the entire house of cards to the ground. Richard was desperate. He was trapped in a financial corner with no way out. The banks would not touch him. Private equity firms would take one look at those tax liens and run the other way. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold smile forming on my lips. Brittany was suffocating Jamal with debt because Richard could no longer afford to finance her vanity. The golden child was bankrupting her husband because her parents were bankrupting themselves. The toxicity was no longer just an emotional burden. It was a quantifiable financial liability. My father needed a miracle. He needed a massive, unsecured corporate bailout to pay off the IRS and keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. And there were very few investment firms in Boston with the capital liquidity to authorize that kind of high-risk corporate rescue. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I realized that my sister had unwittingly brought her brilliant, honest husband right into my domain. She had sent him into the fortress of the very person she had thrown out into the snow. The trap was setting itself, and I did not even have to lift a finger to bait the hook. I just had to wait for the rats to come looking for cheese. 2 full weeks passed since I discovered the photograph on Jamal's desk. I watched him closely, noting the deterioration in his impeccable composure. His tailored suits began to look slightly rumpled. He skipped lunches, subsisting entirely on black coffee. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave, grinding through our acquisitions with desperate intensity. I knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. The financial walls were closing in on my father's real estate company, and the panic was bleeding directly into Jamal's marriage. It happened on a Thursday night at 11 o'clock. The executive floor was deserted. I was in my office reviewing a merger contract when a sudden sharp crash echoed from the cubicle bay outside. I walked to my doorway. Jamal knelt on the floor picking up shattered ceramic. His hands shook violently. The invincible senior auditor had hit his breaking point. He followed me inside my office and collapsed heavily into the guest chair across from my mahogany desk. He buried his face in his hands, taking a ragged breath. His professional armor was completely gone, leaving only an exhausted father. "I am compromising my license," Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am compromising everything I have worked for Clara. I do not know what to do. I am completely trapped." "Explain the liability," I commanded. "Strip the emotion out of it. Give me the raw data." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "It is my father-in-law," he confessed. "He runs a commercial real estate firm. The company is failing. He has millions in undisclosed debt and 3 active IRS tax liens for unpaid payroll taxes. He needs a massive corporate bailout to avoid Chapter 11 bankruptcy and federal prosecution." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I kept my face an absolute blank slate. "And how does his corporate insolvency involve you?" "He needs a certified forensic auditor to sign off on his financial disclosures to secure the loan," Jamal explained. "He wants me to doctor the balance sheets. He is begging me to bury tax liens in a web of synthetic leases and hide negative cash flow using fake vendor invoices. He wants me to validate a fraudulent prospectus so he can defraud an investment bank out of $10 million. If you sign those documents, you become an accessory to wire fraud and tax evasion," I stated coldly. "That carries a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. You lose your CPA license, your career, and your freedom." I told him no. Jamal said, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. I told him I would not commit a felony for his failing business. I refused. "Then what is the problem?" I asked. "If you refuse to sign the fraudulent ledgers, your liability is 0. Because of my wife," Jamal choked out. "She is demanding that I do it. She screams at me every night telling me it is my duty to save her father's legacy. She says I am being selfish. When I refused tonight, she gave me an ultimatum. She told me if I do not sign off on the doctored financials, she will file for divorce. She promised to take my two children, move back to her parents' estate, and ruin me in family court. She is holding my kids hostage over a fraudulent balance sheet. She wants me to choose between federal prison and my children. I looked at Jamal, feeling a cold satisfaction settle over my mind. Brittany had not changed a bit. 15 years ago, she sacrificed my life to the freezing snow to hide her $15,000 theft. Today, she was willing to sacrifice her own husband to federal prison to hide her father's $10 million failure. She weaponized the people who loved her, but she had made a fatal miscalculation. She had threatened an asset that belonged to my firm, and I protect my assets. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk. The trap was fully constructed. I just needed to hand Jamal the key. "You are not going to sign those fraudulent financial documents, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "You are not going to compromise your integrity, and you are certainly not going to federal prison for a man who steals from his own employees." "But my kids," Clara, Jamal pleaded, desperation creeping back into his voice. "She will take them. She will destroy me. She is not going to do anything." I countered, my eyes locking onto his. "Tell your father-in-law to submit his bailout application directly to Reed Capital. Have him route the entire package to my division. Tell your wife that your firm might be interested in acquiring the debt." Jamal stared at me, completely bewildered. "Clara, you cannot approve a $10 million loan for a functionally insolvent company. The IRS liens alone make it a toxic asset. It violates every compliance rule we have." "I am not going to approve a fraudulent loan," I replied, a slow smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I am going to officially evaluate a corporate acquisition. Have him submit the paperwork. Tell your wife you brought the deal to your senior partner. I will handle your father-in-law, and I will handle it entirely within the boundaries of the law. You keep your hands clean." Jamal exhaled a long, shaky breath, the crushing weight lifting from his shoulders just a fraction. He had no idea who my father really was. He had no idea that he had just handed his toxic in-laws directly to their executioner. "Thank you, Clara," he said, standing up. "I will have him send the files tomorrow morning. Make absolutely sure he brings them in person," I instructed, turning my attention back to my computer monitor. "We are going to have a very detailed discussion about his balance sheets. The trap is now officially wide open." 3 days later, the trap snapped shut. The Reed Capital skyscraper pierced the Boston sky, a monument to financial supremacy. Through the revolving doors walked three people I knew intimately, though they had no idea I was watching them on the high-definition security feed, piped directly to my office monitors. Richard, Patricia, and Brittany stepped into the expansive marble lobby. They walked with the swagger of people desperate to project wealth they no longer possessed. It was a masterclass in financial delusion. Richard wore a custom suit, though a trained eye could see the cut was 5 years out of date, tailored before the IRS started freezing his accounts. Patricia dripped with gold jewelry and wore a conspicuous mink coat, items purchased on high-interest credit cards to maintain her country club facade. Brittany embodied the absurdity of their situation. She strutted across the polished marble floor, clutching a limited edition designer bag. That specific handbag retailed for $25,000. I recognized it immediately from the catastrophic credit card statement Jamal reviewed 3 days prior. She was carrying the exact financial liability that was destroying her husband's life, using it as a prop to secure a $10 million bailout for her father. They were bleeding cash from every artery, yet they marched into a billionaire's stronghold acting like conquering royalty. They approached the reception desk with absolute arrogance. Richard leaned against the counter, flashing his bleached teeth at the receptionist. He loudly announced his private meeting with the senior partner regarding a lucrative acquisition deal. He spoke the words with practiced bravado, completely oblivious to the fact that the receptionist already knew his company was functionally insolvent. The receptionist, trained to handle actual billionaires without flinching, offered a polite, icy smile. She handed them security badges and directed them toward the private executive elevators. I switched the security feed on my monitor to track their ascent. The camera captured their private conversation as the steel box rocketed toward the 60th floor. The audio feed was crystal clear. "This is exactly what we needed," Richard said, adjusting his silk tie in the mirrored walls. "I told you Jamal was good for something. He pitched our portfolio to his firm, and they bit immediately. These corporate analysts only look at the top-line revenue. We just need to steer the conversation away from the temporary cash flow issues and focus on the asset valuations." Patricia patted his arm affectionately. "Of course they bit, Richard. We are offering prime real estate. You built a magnificent company. This little tax hiccup with the government is just a minor bureaucratic hurdle. Once we get this capital injection, we can finally pay off those aggressive vendors and get back to normal." Brittany scoffed, checking her pristine makeup in her compact mirror. Jamal was being so dramatic about the whole thing. He actually tried to tell me he would not submit the paperwork because it violated his precious accounting ethics. I had to threaten to take the kids and move into the guest house just to get him to do his job. These corporate suits do not care about ethics. They care about making money. We just hand over the ledger's smile and walk out with a $10 million wire transfer. Jamal's boss is probably just another desk jockey looking for a quick commission. The elevator chimed, depositing them onto the executive floor. My assistant met them at the doors. I watched through the glass walls of my office as she escorted them down the long corridor toward the primary boardroom. The executive suite of Reed Capital was designed to intimidate. There were no warm colors, no welcoming paintings. It was a fortress of brushed steel black marble and soundproof glass. The silence on the floor was heavy and oppressive, the sound of massive wealth moving quietly through digital channels. My assistant opened the heavy double doors to the main boardroom and gestured for them to enter. The space was a massive glass box suspended over the city. A 20-foot polished obsidian table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The far wall was entirely transparent, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the Boston Harbor. It was a room where multi-billion-dollar corporations were dismantled and sold for parts. It was an execution chamber for bad businesses. Richard walked in and immediately took a seat near the head of the table, spreading his doctored financial files across the polished black stone with unearned confidence. He arranged the fraudulent balance sheets, the fake vendor invoices, and the manipulated asset valuations in neat, precise stacks. He was setting up a magic trick, hoping the sleight of hand would distract the audience from the massive gaping holes in his narrative. Patricia sat delicately beside him, draping her mink coat over the back of her chair, to ensure the designer label remained visible. Brittany took the seat on his other side, placing her $25,000 handbag directly on the table like a centerpiece. They were completely isolated inside the soundproof glass walls. I remained in my private office just down the hall, watching them through the tinted partition. They were laughing now. Richard made a joke, and Patricia touched his shoulder affectionately. Brittany pulled out her phone, likely texting her country club friends about her father's massive new business deal. They felt victorious. They genuinely believed their fake ledgers and synthetic leases were sophisticated enough to fool an investment firm that managed global sovereign wealth funds. They thought they had outsmarted the system. They thought Jamal had blindly submitted their lies to a clueless middle manager. The sheer audacity of their delusion was breathtaking. They were sitting inside the belly of the beast, smelling the absolute danger of their surroundings and choosing to believe they were the predators. Richard checked his gold watch, tapping his polished leather shoe against the floor, visibly annoyed that the senior partner was making him wait. He did not realize the waiting was a calculated psychological tactic. In the world of high finance, the person who controls the clock controls the power dynamic. I let them sit in that silent, intimidating glass box for exactly 15 minutes. I let the oppressive quiet of the room slowly chip away at their false bravado. I watched Richard check his watch for the fourth time. The confident smiles were beginning to slip, replaced by the faint, nagging prickle of anxiety. Brittany stopped texting. Patricia pulled her coat slightly closer. The room was designed to make people feel small, and it was working perfectly. I closed my laptop and stood up from my mahogany desk. I picked up the single manila folder containing the absolute destruction of their entire lives. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. It was time. I walked out of my office, my heels echoing sharply against the marble floor, and headed straight for the glass boardroom doors. The trap was about to close. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the boardroom. The thick glass swung inward with a soft pneumatic hiss, instantly shattering the suffocating silence they had been sitting in. I did not rush. I walked into the room with the measured, deliberate strides of an apex predator stepping into an enclosed hunting ground. The sound of my heels striking the polished floor echoed off the glass walls like the ticking of a countdown clock. Richard was sitting near the head of the table, an expensive gold pen twirling between his fingers as he prepared to dazzle whoever walked through those doors. He looked up, his rehearsed charismatic smile already plastered across his face. The smile died instantly. The gold pen slipped from his fingers, hitting the black obsidian table with a sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. It rolled off the edge and bounced onto the carpet, completely ignored. The color drained from his face so fast it looked as if his heart had simply stopped beating. His jaw went slack, his eyes widening in absolute unfiltered shock. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. Patricia gasped, a loud, sharp intake of air that bordered on a shriek. Her hands flew to her chest, clutching the collar of her mink coat, as if trying to shield herself from an incoming physical blow. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between my face and the door behind me, desperately hoping this was some kind of bizarre mistake, or that the real senior partner was walking in behind me. Brittany did not gasp. She glared, her perfectly contoured face twisted into an immediate scowl of hostility and profound confusion. She gripped her $25,000 handbag, her knuckles turning white. She could not comprehend how the sister she had thrown into a blizzard had just walked into an elite investment firm boardroom wearing a tailored suit that projected more power and wealth than her entire manufactured existence. I stopped at the head of the table. I did not smile. I did not greet them. I simply stood there, letting the crushing weight of my presence suffocate the last remaining ounces of their false bravado. Patricia was the first to recover. Years of country club survival instincts kicked in, overriding her shock with pure desperate manipulation. She forced her facial muscles to contort into an expression of overwhelming joy. She leaped out of her ergonomic leather chair, her heels scraping against the floor, and threw her arms wide open. "Clara." Patricia cried out, her voice pitching up into a shrill theatrical tone of fake affection. "Oh my God, you are the partner! I cannot believe it! Look at you! You look so professional!" She rushed toward me, fully intending to wrap me in a tight motherly embrace, completely ignoring the fact that the last time we shared physical space, she was throwing my belongings into a freezing snowstorm. She wanted to bridge the 15-year gap of abandonment with a single performative hug. I raised my left hand, holding it flat in the air. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my gesture stopped her dead in her tracks, a mere 2 feet away from me. "Sit down," I commanded. The words were flat cold and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. Patricia froze, her arms still awkwardly suspended in the air. The fake smile quivered on her lips. "Clara, sweetheart, please. It has been so long. Our family is finally reunited. This is a sign. This is an absolute miracle. You are going to save your father's legacy, right? You are going to help us." Richard finally found his voice. He stood up, desperately trying to salvage his shattered patriarchal authority. He adjusted his suit jacket, pasting on a sickeningly proud expression. "My daughter running the mergers and acquisitions division at Reed Capital. I always knew you had a sharp mind for business. We are ready to make a deal, Clara. We kept it in the family." The sheer, unadulterated delusion was magnificent. They actually believed they could gaslight me into a $10 million corporate bailout. They thought 15 years of silence and survival could be erased with a single compliment. They thought I was still the vulnerable, sick teenager desperate for their validation. I lowered my hand and walked past Patricia, leaving her standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. I took the chair at the absolute head of the obsidian table, the seat of ultimate power. I placed my sleek manila folder on the glass surface and aligned it perfectly with the edge of the desk. Brittany finally spoke, her voice laced with venom and entitlement. "You cannot be the partner evaluating our loan. That is a massive conflict of interest. We demand to see your superior. We are not doing business with a college dropout." I turned my gaze to Brittany. The coldness in my eyes made her physically recoil into her chair. "There is no superior, Brittany," I stated smoothly. "I am the senior partner of this division. I authorize every acquisition, every hostile takeover, and every corporate bailout that moves through this firm. And as for a conflict of interest, you are entirely correct. Under normal circumstances, I would recuse myself from evaluating a family business. However, my legal team has thoroughly reviewed my background. Since Richard legally disowned me 15 years ago, and my name was permanently removed from all your family trusts, insurance policies, and inheritance documents, the Federal Compliance Board recognizes zero familial relation between us. Legally speaking, we are absolute strangers." Richard swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing its way down his temple. "Clara, let us be reasonable. We are here to talk about numbers, about an investment." I unclasped the manila folder and flipped it open. I stared down at the damning evidence of their financial ruin, then looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "I am not your daughter today," I said, my voice slicing through the boardroom like a scalpel. "I am the executioner of your company. Let us look at the numbers." The silence that followed was absolute. I tapped the touchpad embedded in the conference table, and the massive high-definition smart screen on the far wall flared to life. The glowing projection illuminated the dark room, casting harsh light over their panicked faces. I did not pull up their carefully doctored presentation. I pulled up the raw, unfiltered data my forensic software had extracted from the darkest corners of their corporate history. The screen displayed a massive, undeniable web of red ink tax liabilities and hidden corporate rot. "You came here asking for a $10 million lifeline," I continued, leaning back in my leather chair. "You submitted a prospectus claiming a 20% year-over-year growth. You sat in my lobby projecting wealth and stability. You demanded respect from my staff. But the data on this screen tells a very different story." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He tried to project confidence, but his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Those numbers are taken completely out of context," he stammered. "Real estate is cyclical. We have massive physical assets backing those temporary cash flow dips." I did not blink. I tapped the screen again, zooming in on the exact section of the ledger that would destroy his final shred of dignity. I was about to dissect his empire piece by piece, and there was absolutely no place left for him to hide. "Cyclical cash flow dips are a normal part of commercial real estate," I said, my voice echoing evenly off the thick glass walls. "What you are looking at on this screen is not a market fluctuation, it is a systematic hemorrhage of capital." I tapped the control panel. The main display shifted from a standard bar graph to a complex web of corporate entities. Red lines connected Richard's primary development group to 3 separate limited liability corporations registered in the British Virgin Islands. "Let us talk about your physical assets. You claim they back your debt, but you transferred the deeds of your 3 most profitable commercial spaces into these offshore holding companies 14 months ago." Richard swallowed hard. "That is a standard asset protection strategy. Everyone in my tax bracket utilizes offshore restructuring to shield properties from frivolous litigation. It is entirely legal." "Asset protection is legal," I countered instantly. "Using those same offshore entities to lease the properties back to your own domestic firm at an inflated premium of 400% is not an asset protection strategy. It is fraud. You are intentionally draining your domestic operating budget to manufacture a paper loss, while simultaneously hiding the revenue offshore." Patricia shifted in her seat, her mink coat suddenly looking very heavy on her shoulders. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to confidently dismiss my claims. He did not. He just stared at the screen, a visible tremor starting in his jaw. I tapped the screen again. A series of invoices appeared side by side with bank transfer records. "This brings us to your vendor expenses. You reported spending $2.5 million on contracting services for the downtown plaza renovation over the last fiscal year. I ran the tax identification numbers on the invoices you provided. I highlighted 3 specific vendor names in bright yellow. These contracting companies do not exist. They have no registered employees, no heavy equipment, and no physical addresses. The registered agent for all 3 companies is a single post office box in Delaware. Yet your accounts payable department wired $2.5 million to them. Where did that money actually go, Richard? You are misinterpreting the ledgers, Richard fired back, his voice rising in volume as panic set in. Those are umbrella management groups. We use them to subcontract smaller local crews to avoid union disputes. It streamlines the accounting process. You are sitting in an ivory tower judging boots on the ground operations. This is how development works. Do not attempt to lecture me on real-world development, I stated flatly. Under the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, creating phantom vendor accounts to siphon liquidity from a failing enterprise constitutes intentional fraud. I traced these wire transfers. The funds did not go to local subcontractors. The money bounced from Delaware directly to an account in the Cayman Islands. That account happens to be the exact same one holding your inflated lease payments. You are bleeding your own company dry and trying to convince a bank to refill the tank. Brittany crossed her arms. So what? It is his company. He built it. He can move his own money however he wants. You are just trying to find a reason to say no because you are still obsessed with getting back at us. I did not even look at Brittany. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on my father. A sole proprietor can burn his own money, I explained methodically. But you are not a sole proprietor anymore. You took out a $5 million mezzanine loan 2 years ago. You pledged your corporate revenue as collateral to secure that capital. By intentionally moving that revenue offshore to avoid paying your creditors, you violated the primary covenant of your loan agreement. That makes your entire debt portfolio callable immediately. Richard slumped slightly in his chair. The aggressive posture he had walked in with was completely gone. But I was not finished. The most devastating piece of evidence was still waiting. I tapped the console one final time. The screen flashed bright red. The official emblem of the Internal Revenue Service appeared next to a terrifying sequence of negative numbers. Offshore accounts and fake invoices will get you sued by your creditors, I said, leaning forward to ensure he heard every single syllable. But this will put you in a federal penitentiary. Patricia gasped loudly, her manicured hands flying to cover her mouth. You have not remitted a single dollar of payroll tax for your employees in 18 months, I stated, letting the words hang heavily in the cold air of the boardroom. You deducted the taxes from your workers' paychecks every 2 weeks, but you never submitted the filings to the federal government. You kept their money to float your failing operations. It was a temporary reallocation, Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors. We hit a severe cash flow bottleneck. I plan to make the IRS whole the second we secured this $10 million bailout. That is why we are here today, to fix it. You cannot fix this with a corporate loan, I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy. The IRS does not view unpaid payroll taxes as a standard corporate debt. They view it as theft of government property. Under federal tax law, this is called the Trust Fund Recovery Penalty. Because you are the chief executive officer who made the conscious decision to withhold those funds, the corporate veil will not protect you. The federal government will pierce your company and hold you personally liable. I let the absolute reality of his situation crash down on him. They will seize your personal bank accounts. They will place a lien on your primary residence. They will auction your cars, your club memberships, and every piece of jewelry your wife is currently wearing. And because the stolen amount exceeds $1 million, it crosses the threshold into criminal tax evasion. This is a federal felony. Patricia turned to Richard, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Richard, tell her she is wrong. Tell her our lawyers can handle this. Tell her we are fine. Richard did not even attempt to answer her desperate question. He sat completely paralyzed, staring at the glowing red numbers on the smart screen. The grand illusion of his wealth was dead. The real estate empire he had sacrificed my life to protect was entirely gone. He was not a respected real estate tycoon anymore. He was a white-collar criminal waiting to be indicted. And I was the only one holding all the damning evidence. The heavy silence in the boardroom was finally shattered by the sharp scraping of a chair against the marble floor. Brittany stood up. Her perfect posture was gone, replaced by the rigid stance of a cornered animal. She looked at the glowing red numbers on the screen, then turned her furious gaze toward me. The reality had finally pierced her thick bubble of entitlement. There would be no $10 million wire transfer. Her endless supply of luxury was officially terminated. Brittany slammed her hands down on the black obsidian table. "This is a setup!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls. "You never had any intention of giving us a loan. You just brought us up here to humiliate us." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the manila folder. "I did not invite you here, Brittany," I stated evenly. "Your father submitted an application for corporate restructuring to Reed Capital. I simply processed the data he provided. Numbers have no emotional agenda. They just expose the truth." "The truth?" Brittany scoffed, her face turning a mottled shade of red. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, reverting instantly to the exact tactic she used when we were teenagers. "The truth is, you are nothing but a bitter college dropout, trying to get revenge on the family that finally had enough of your garbage. We kicked you out because you were an addict stealing from your own father to buy drugs." Patricia gasped, though she did not tell Brittany to stop. Richard remained frozen, staring blankly at the federal tax liens projected on the wall. "You think wearing a fancy suit changes who you are?" Brittany continued, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You think working for some billionaire makes you better than us? We do not need your arrogant lectures, and we certainly do not need your fake corporate money. He will find another investor by tomorrow morning, and you will go back to being the miserable outcast you have always been." I let her finish. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me, waiting for me to break. She expected me to scream, to cry, to try and validate my existence just like I did 15 years ago. I did not do any of those things. I simply reached out and tapped the control panel on the table. The screen instantly changed. The red IRS warning vanished. In its place appeared a highly detailed, extremely specific ledger. It was a domestic operational expense sheet highlighted with 50 different transaction markers. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Brittany," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You do not need my money. You have already taken everything your father had left." Richard blinked, pulling his attention away from his impending federal prosecution. He squinted at the new spreadsheet on the screen. "What is this?" he asked, his voice hoarse and broken. "This is the internal consulting fee ledger for your primary real estate firm," I explained. "You authorized a general consulting retainer for your daughter 5 years ago. But you stopped looking at the detailed line items when the market turned, did you not?" I tapped the screen. A yellow box highlighted a specific monthly withdrawal. "Brittany has not been drawing a modest stipend," I stated. "For the past 36 months, she has systematically siphoned exactly $20,000 a month from your operating budget. She classified it under miscellaneous consulting expenses. She bypassed your payroll department entirely to avoid raising red flags with your internal controllers." Brittany went rigid. Her aggressive posture instantly evaporated. The furious flush on her face drained away, leaving her looking sickly and pale. "Shut up," she whispered, her voice suddenly small and terrified. "You do not know what you are talking about. That is my money. I earned it." "You earned it by doing what exactly?" I challenged, my eyes locking onto hers. "By spending 3 weeks in the Maldives last February, or by purchasing a $25,000 designer handbag, the exact same one currently sitting on this conference table." "I pulled your personal credit card statements, Brittany. Your spending habits are a matter of public record when they directly impact the liquidity of an acquisition target." Patricia turned to her favorite daughter, her eyes wide with shock. "Brittany, what is she talking about? $20,000 a month. We have been struggling to pay the mortgage on the house. You told me you were barely surviving on your husband's salary." Richard stood up slowly. He leaned heavily on the glass table, his gaze fixed entirely on the yellow highlighted numbers. He was doing the mental math. $20,000 a month. $240,000 a year. Over 3 years, Brittany had quietly drained nearly $750,000 from his failing company in pure, untraceable cash. That money, I explained to my father with surgical precision, is the exact amount you needed to pay your quarterly payroll taxes. Your golden child did not just steal your money. She stole the funds that would have kept you out of federal prison. She drove your company into absolute bankruptcy to fund her luxury shopping sprees. You threw me into a blizzard for $15,000, Richard. Your favorite daughter just stole $750,000 and she is the reason you are going to jail. Brittany shook her head frantically, backing away from the table. No, no, Daddy, she is lying. The ledgers are fake. She is just trying to tear our family apart. Do not listen to her. But Richard was not listening to Brittany anymore. He was staring at the undeniable financial footprint of his own destruction. The golden child had finally been exposed not by emotion, but by the cold, unforgiving reality of a balance sheet. The trap had closed completely, and there was no way out. The air in the glass boardroom grew thick and suffocating. Richard remained entirely silent, his eyes locked on the digital projection of his own financial demise. He did not yell at Brittany. He did not demand an explanation. The sheer magnitude of her theft had completely short-circuited his brain. Patricia sank back into her ergonomic leather chair, burying her face in her hands, her carefully maintained country club facade crumbling into quiet, pathetic sobs. Brittany looked back and forth between her broken parents. For her entire life, they had been her impenetrable shield. Whenever she made a mistake, whenever she overspent or lied or stole, Richard and Patricia had rushed to cover it up and blame someone else, usually me. But right now, gazing at the undeniable evidence of her massive corporate embezzlement, they offered her zero protection. She was finally on her own. Narcissists do not accept defeat gracefully. When cornered, they do not apologize. They simply search for a bigger weapon. Brittany straightened her posture aggressively, smoothing the wrinkles out of her designer dress. The panic in her eyes was rapidly replaced by a frantic, venomous desperation. If her father could no longer protect her, she would find someone who could. She reached into her $25,000 handbag and snatched her smartphone, gripping it like a loaded gun. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Clara Brittany sneered, her voice dripping with absolute malice. "You think you can just project a few fake spreadsheets on a wall and destroy my family? You think you hold all the power in this building because you have a fancy title and a glass office, but you made a massive miscalculation." I did not say a word. I simply watched her, my face completely impassive. I knew exactly what she was about to do, and I welcomed it. "My husband works at this firm," Brittany announced, lifting her chin with a triumphant, arrogant sneer. "He is not just some entry-level desk clerk. He is a senior auditor. He is one of the most respected financial minds in this entire building. And he knows every single compliance law, human resources regulation, and corporate policy you just violated by bringing us up here." Patricia looked up through her tears, a tiny, desperate glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes. "Brittany, what are you doing? I am fixing this." "Mom," Brittany snapped, never taking her furious glare off my face. "I am going to have this psychotic woman terminated." Brittany pointed her phone directly at me. "What you are doing right now is a textbook conflict of interest. You are using corporate resources to execute a personal vendetta. That is a massive breach of fiduciary duty. When my husband reports this, you will not just be fired. You will be blacklisted from the financial sector. You will lose this fancy office and you will be thrown right back out onto the street where you belong." She held the phone high, her thumb hovering over the screen. "I am calling him right now," she threatened, her voice echoing sharply against the soundproof glass walls. "I am telling him exactly what his psychotic boss is doing to his family. We will see how much power you actually have when a senior auditor exposes your illegal vendetta to the compliance division." The room went completely still. Richard finally looked up, his eyes darting between me and his golden child. He looked like a drowning man hoping for a life raft. He was too broken to speak, willing to let his daughter destroy my career to save his business. I leaned back slowly in my leather chair, letting the expensive material creak. I brought my hands together, resting my elbows on the armrests, and steepled my fingers. I was completely relaxed. The absolute confidence I projected made Brittany hesitate. She expected me to panic. She expected the terrified teenager from 15 years ago. By all means, Brittany, I said, my voice utterly devoid of fear. Make the call. But if you are going to leverage your husband to have me terminated, I insist you do it transparently. Put him on speakerphone. Let the entire room hear how you plan to destroy my career. Brittany sneered, mistaking my cold demeanor for a desperate bluff. You asked for it, she hissed. She tapped the screen and slammed her finger down on the speaker icon. She tossed the device onto the center of the black obsidian table. The ringing tone echoed loudly through the sterile boardroom. 1 ring, 2 rings. Brittany's posture grew more aggressive. She was preparing for the performance of a lifetime. She gathered the exact same fake tears she used 15 years ago when she framed me for stealing. She was about to weaponize her victimhood against a man who trusted her implicitly. She relied on his love to manipulate him. On the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. Hello? Jamal's deep, steady voice filled the room. The audio was crystal clear. Brittany instantly launched into her performance. Her voice cracked perfectly. A desperate, terrified sob escaped her throat. Jamal. Oh my God, Jamal. You have to help us. Please, you have to come to the main executive boardroom right now. Brittany. What is wrong? Jamal asked. His voice sounded professional, but there was a distinct sharp edge to it. It is your boss, Brittany cried out, forcing genuine hysteria into her tone. The senior partner evaluating my dad's restructuring. Jamal, she is a complete psychopath. She is attacking my family. She locked us in this room and is projecting horrible fake spreadsheets on the wall, accusing me of stealing money from my father. Patricia began to weep softly in the background, adding an authentic soundtrack of distress to her daughter's performance. Richard remained silent, watching the phone as if it were a bomb about to detonate. She is insane, Jamal, Brittany screamed, pacing beside the table. She has a personal vendetta from years ago and is using your company's resources to torture us. You have to call human resources. You have to call compliance immediately. She is committing corporate fraud. She is harassing us. She is trying to ruin my dad's life out of pure spite. You have to get her fired right now. I sat at the head of the table, my fingers resting beneath my chin. I watched the golden child weave her web of lies, pouring every ounce of manipulation into the speakerphone. She painted herself as the innocent victim trapped in a boardroom with a monster. She demanded her husband act as her white knight, entirely confident his blind loyalty would shield her from the consequences of her actions. She assumed her husband was just another tool she could use. There was a heavy pause on the line. The silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. Brittany stopped pacing, leaning closer to the phone, waiting for her husband to unleash his fury on my behalf. She wiped a single calculated tear from her cheek, preparing to play the rescued princess. I remained perfectly still. I did not interrupt her rant. I did not attempt to defend myself over the open line. I simply waited for the inevitable conclusion of this trap. I knew exactly who Jamal was. I knew exactly what kind of man she had married, even if she did not. I am on my way, Jamal said. The line went dead, with a sharp electronic click. Brittany snatched her smartphone off the black obsidian table and dropped it back into her $25,000 designer handbag. She looked at her parents, nodding sharply, silently, assuring them that salvation was marching down the hallway. They truly believed the cavalry was coming. They thought Jamal would burst through the glass doors, throw a compliance badge on the table, and demand my immediate termination. I remained seated at the head of the table, entirely relaxed. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a rush of air. Jamal stepped into the room. He did not look panicked. He did not look like a white knight rushing to rescue his distressed wife. He looked like an executioner arriving for a scheduled appointment. Brittany launched into her performance the second his polished shoes hit the marble floor. She practically threw herself across the room, letting out a calculated, dramatic sob. She collided with Jamal, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face into the lapel of his suit. Jamal. Thank God you are here, Brittany cried out, her voice vibrating with manufactured terror. She is a monster. She is using fake financial documents to extort us. She is a complete psychopath trying to ruin my family because she is jealous of me. You have to call human resources right now. You have to get security and have her thrown out of this building before she destroys my father's legacy. Jamal, do something. She is ruining us. Richard stood up, trying to project masculine solidarity with his son-in-law. We need corporate compliance involved immediately, Jamal. This senior partner is executing a personal vendetta using Reed Capital Resources. We just need you to initiate the internal investigation. Jamal stood perfectly still. He ignored Brittany's desperate embrace. He did not wrap his arms around her to comfort her. He did not look at Richard or Patricia. The silence in the glass boardroom grew thick and suffocating. Instead, she saw a glacier. Jamal reached up. He placed his large hands firmly on Brittany's wrists. With slow, deliberate force, he peeled her manicured fingers off his suit jacket. He did not shove her. He simply removed her from his personal space as if she were a toxic contaminant. Brittany stumbled back a half step, her high heels clicking awkwardly on the marble floor. Genuine confusion flashed across her face. Jamal, what are you doing? She asked, her voice dropping its theatrical pitch. Jamal did not answer her. He walked past his bewildered wife. He walked past Richard, who was frozen by the sudden shift in the room's dynamic. He walked past Patricia, who shrank back into her leather chair. Jamal walked straight to the head of the polished obsidian table. He stopped right next to my chair. He set his worn leather briefcase on the glass surface and turned to face his in-laws. He stood shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a unified, impenetrable wall of corporate authority. Brittany's eyes darted frantically between me and her husband. The triumphant smirk had entirely vanished. "Why are you standing next to her?" she demanded, panic bleeding into her tone. "Jamal, she is the one attacking us. She is the enemy." Jamal looked at his wife, and the sheer volume of absolute disgust in his eyes was devastating. He looked at her not as a husband viewing his bride, but as an auditor examining a corrupt asset. "Clara did not just audit your company," Jamal stated. His voice was incredibly calm, yet it struck the room with the force of a wrecking ball. "I did. I have been working with her for 2 weeks to uncover every single cent you stole." The air vanished from the room. Richard collapsed back into his chair as if his knees had been physically shattered. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a strangled gasp. Brittany stood frozen in the center of the floor, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "You thought I brought your father's bailout application to a clueless middle manager?" Jamal continued, his tone methodical and relentless. "You thought you could force me to sign off on fraudulent ledgers to save your father from a federal indictment. You thought you could use my professional integrity as a shield for your criminal behavior. But you made a critical error, Brittany. You threatened my career, my license, and my children over a lie. So I took your father's financial portfolio directly to the most ruthless senior partner in this entire building. I brought it to Clara." Brittany shook her head wildly, refusing to process the reality crashing down on her. "No. No, that is impossible. She is lying to you, Jamal. She manipulated the data to make it look like I did something wrong. You know me. I am your wife." Jamal reached into his briefcase. He did not pull out a compliance badge. He pulled out a thick stack of printed financial records. He slammed the stack onto the glass table. "Do not insult my intelligence," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a lethal commanding register. "Clara did not manipulate a single digit. I tracked the wire transfers myself. I found the synthetic leases. I uncovered the offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands. I traced the phantom vendor invoices directly back to your personal consulting fee ledger. I spent 80 hours mapping the exact trajectory of your embezzlement. You siphoned $20,000 a month from a failing company while your father stopped paying his employees' payroll taxes. You committed corporate fraud, Brittany." Richard buried his face in his hands. The illusion was dead. The man he thought he could fool was the very architect of his destruction. I sat quietly watching the golden child realize that the very person she had tried to weaponize was the one holding the blade. Jamal stood tall, an unshakable pillar of absolute truth, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. Jamal reached across the polished obsidian table and pressed his finger against the control panel. The massive smart screen on the far wall flickered. The damning corporate ledgers containing Richard's federal tax evasion vanished. In their place, a new set of documents materialized. These were not stamped with the logos of shell companies or offshore accounts. These were standard retail banking statements, the kind any ordinary household receives in the mail. I sat back and watched a masterclass in forensic destruction. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The lethal precision of his presentation was terrifying enough. When you demanded that I commit wire fraud to save your father, Jamal began, keeping his eyes locked on Brittany. You made a tactical error. You reminded me that I am a senior auditor. My entire career is built on finding discrepancies that people desperately want to keep hidden. When I realized you were embezzling from the family business, I asked myself a very simple question. If my wife is willing to steal from her own father to fund her shopping addiction, who else is she stealing from? Brittany took another step backward. Her spine hit the glass wall of the boardroom. The arrogant fire that usually burned in her eyes was entirely extinguished. She looked like a ghost. I audited our own house, Jamal stated. He tapped the screen. Two specific financial portfolios appeared side by side. They were 529 college savings plans. The accounts Jamal had set up the week each of their children was born. I knew from our late-night conversations how fiercely Jamal protected those accounts. He took extra shifts, sacrificed his weekends, and lived on break-room coffee just to ensure his kids would never have to take out a student loan. Those accounts represented his blood, sweat, and absolute devotion as a father. Look at the balance, Jamal commanded, gesturing to the glowing white numbers on the screen. Richard and Patricia turned their heads to look. The balance on both accounts was 0. Patricia let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Richard stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the betrayal. Even for a man who withheld taxes from his own employees, the idea of robbing infants of their future was staggering. 3 weeks ago, Jamal explained, his voice growing dangerously cold, the cash flow from your father's failing real estate firm finally dried up. The $20,000 a month you were siphoning stopped coming through. But your luxury credit card bills did not stop. The creditors started calling our home. You panicked. You knew that if I saw those statements, I would realize you were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars we did not have. You needed liquidity immediately to cover your tracks. Jamal tapped the screen one more time. A highly magnified digital signature document appeared. It was a withdrawal authorization form from the investment bank managing the college funds. You needed both parental signatures to liquidate a 529 plan, Jamal said. You logged into my secure email from my home office computer. You bypassed the two-factor authentication because you knew my passcode. And then you forged my digital signature. You drained every single cent I had saved for our children over the past 5 years. You triggered a massive early withdrawal tax penalty, and you took the cash to pay off your secret designer debt. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The golden child illusion did not just crack. It shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Patricia looked at her favorite daughter with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Brittany. Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with revulsion. You stole from your own babies. You stole from your children to buy handbags. Richard looked physically sick. He had spent his entire life elevating Brittany, holding her up as the pinnacle of their family's success. He had kicked me out into a deadly blizzard just to protect her reputation. And now he was staring at a woman who was infinitely more corrupt than he could ever be. She was a financial predator who fed on her own offspring. It was a bridge loan. Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking in a desperate attempt to salvage her ruined image. She pushed away from the glass wall, holding her hands up defensively. I was going to put it back. I swear I was going to put it back. Once Daddy got the $10 million bailout from the firm, I was going to replenish the accounts. I just needed to float the credit payments so you would not find out. I was protecting our marriage, Jamal. You were protecting your vanity, Jamal fired back, slicing through her pathetic excuses with absolute authority. You did not secure a bridge loan. You committed identity theft and wire fraud. You robbed the people you are biologically programmed to protect. You looked at our children, and you decided your country club status was more important than their education. Brittany turned to her parents, her eyes wide and pleading. Mom, Dad, please tell him. Tell him I had to do it. You know how important it is to maintain our lifestyle. The other wives were starting to ask questions. I had to keep up appearances. Daddy, you understand, right? You hid debt too. We do what we have to do. Richard actually recoiled from her. He stepped away, physically distancing himself from the monster he and Patricia had created. For the first time in his miserable life, Richard realized the true cost of his toxic parenting. He had bred a parasite. Do not compare me to you. Richard muttered, his voice hollow and defeated. I tried to save a company. You stole from infants. Brittany stood completely alone in the center of the room. The people who had enabled her worst behavior for nearly 3 decades were now looking at her with absolute disgust. The invincible golden child was completely stripped of her armor. There were no more lies left to tell. There were no more victims left to blame. The balance sheet had exposed her true nature, and the math was undeniable. Jamal closed his briefcase with a loud, definitive snap. He looked at the woman he had loved, the woman he had worked himself to the bone to provide for, and he did not show a single ounce of mercy. The audit was complete. The liability was isolated. Now it was time to execute the final penalty. Brittany stared at the closed briefcase. The sharp snap echoed in the silent room, signaling the absolute end of her marriage. But a narcissist never truly believes they have lost until the very last avenue of manipulation is exhausted. She immediately shifted her tactics. The angry, entitled heiress vanished. In her place stood a fragile, misunderstood victim. She let her shoulders slump. She forced fresh, glossy tears to pool in her eyes. She clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. Jamal. Please, Brittany whimpered, her voice quivering with perfectly calibrated vulnerability. You are not seeing the whole picture. I was under so much toxic pressure. Growing up in this family, the expectations were crushing me. I was suffering from severe financial anxiety and generational trauma. I made a mistake because my mental health was completely deteriorating. You cannot abandon your family over money. You are supposed to be my safe space. She took a tentative step toward him, extending a trembling hand. We can go to couples counseling. We can heal from this. If you walk away now, you are just perpetuating the cycle of abandonment. You are choosing a financial spreadsheet over your own wife and children. That is financial abuse, Jamal. You are financially abusing me by withdrawing your emotional support when I am at my lowest. I sat at the head of the table, genuinely impressed by the sheer audacity of her performance. She had seamlessly woven modern therapy buzzwords into a shield for her own criminal behavior. She was attempting to reframe felony wire fraud and the theft of our nephew's college funds as a mental health crisis. She wanted Jamal to feel guilty for catching her stealing. Jamal did not take a step back. He stood his ground, letting her desperate, manipulative words wash over him like rain against a granite wall. He did not look angry anymore. He just looked supremely tired of her lies. He did not reach out to take her hand. He let it hang suspended in the cold air between them until she awkwardly lowered it back to her side. You are incredibly fluent in the language of therapy, Brittany, Jamal stated, his voice completely flat. But you are fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. You are not a victim of toxic expectations. You are the architect of your own destruction. Generational trauma does not forge a digital signature to liquidate a 529 college savings plan. Financial anxiety does not book a 3-week luxury vacation to the Maldives. You did not make a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. You engaged in a systematic multi-year campaign of financial deception and embezzlement. Brittany let out another theatrical sob, covering her face with her hands. I am the mother of your children, she cried out. You cannot do this to me. We took vows. You violated those vows the second you decided my career and our children's future were acceptable collateral damage for your shopping addiction, Jamal countered swiftly. He reached into the side pocket of his worn leather briefcase. He did not pull out a tissue to dry her fake tears. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He held the envelope for a brief second, feeling the weight of the legal documents inside. Then he dropped it directly onto the black obsidian table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that made Patricia jump in her seat. "Those are divorce papers," Jamal announced. The words hung in the sterile boardroom air, cutting through Brittany's manufactured hysteria with absolute finality. "I had my attorney draft them yesterday morning immediately after I finished tracking the stolen funds from the college accounts. I have already signed them." Brittany stared at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake. She shook her head in rapid, frantic denial. "No, no, Jamal, I will not sign them. I will fight you. I will take half of everything you own. You cannot just discard me. You have nothing left to fight with," Jamal replied, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I am filing for sole physical and legal custody of our children. You are an active threat to their financial and emotional well-being. You are a financial predator and a fraud. You have demonstrated a complete inability to prioritize their basic needs over your own vanity. I will not allow you to raise them in this toxic environment, and I will certainly not allow you to drain any more of their resources." Richard tried to intervene, his voice weak and raspy. "Jamal, be reasonable. A custody battle will destroy the children. We can settle this quietly. I will personally reimburse the college accounts once we secure new funding." "With what money?" Richard Jamal fired back, turning his sharp gaze on his former father-in-law. "Your company is bankrupt. Your assets are about to be frozen. You are in no position to negotiate on her behalf. My lawyer has already filed for an emergency injunction to freeze all joint marital assets to prevent your daughter from hiding any more capital. You will both be hearing from him by the end of the business day." Jamal turned his attention back to Brittany, delivering the final devastating blow. "And you will also be hearing from the IRS. When I discovered the offshore accounts and the phantom vendor invoices, I was legally obligated as a certified public accountant to report the discrepancies to federal regulators to protect my own license. I submitted a comprehensive whistleblower report this morning. I handed them the entire audit. Your father's tax evasion, your embezzled consulting fees, the synthetic leases, all of it." Brittany's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the ergonomic leather chair beside her mother, her pristine designer dress bunching up awkwardly around her knees. The therapy buzzwords evaporated. The fake tears dried up instantly. She was staring down the barrel of a federal investigation, a hostile divorce, and the complete loss of her children. "I am officially done auditing your family," Jamal said, picking up his briefcase. He did not look back as he turned and walked toward the glass doors. He left the golden child sitting in the ruins of her own making, completely surrounded by the crushing weight of absolute, undeniable accountability. The heavy glass doors hissed shut behind Jamal, permanently sealing us inside the soundproof boardroom. The final click of the metal latch echoed loudly, like a gavel striking a block. Brittany remained slumped in her chair, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands, shivering. The reality of losing her husband, her children, and her social standing had finally short-circuited her narcissistic brain. But the true horror was reserved for Richard and Patricia. The federal whistleblower report changed the landscape. This was an active criminal investigation. Richard stared at the closed doors, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The tailored suit he wore looked like a suffocating straitjacket. He turned his head slowly, locking his eyes onto his oldest daughter. The unconditional love and fierce protection he had showered upon his golden child evaporated instantly. It was replaced by raw, unmistakable panic. "You ruined us!" Richard hissed, his voice trembling with terror and fury. "You greedy, selfish little parasite! You drained my company dry. You forged signatures. You dragged the federal government to our front doorstep." Patricia jumped away from her favorite daughter, looking at Brittany as if she carried a contagious disease. "We gave you everything," Patricia shrieked, her country club facade obliterated. "We paid for your luxury cars and designer clothes. We covered up every mistake you ever made, and you repay us by stealing $750,000 and getting your father investigated for tax evasion. You completely destroyed this family." Brittany looked up, her dark mascara smeared. She reached a trembling hand toward her mother. "Mom, please help me. I am your daughter. I do not have a defense lawyer. Jamal is going to take my babies. I am not helping you." Patricia snapped, smacking Brittany's hand away. "You are on your own. We have a legal nightmare to deal with because of your stupidity. You are not dragging us into a federal indictment with you." The swiftness with which they turned on their golden child was breathtaking. For 15 years they worshipped at the altar of Brittany's perfection. They sacrificed my teenage life to protect her reputation, but the second their survival was threatened, they threw her to the wolves without a second thought. Their parental love was conditional, entirely dependent on who provided them with the most social and financial value. Realizing Brittany was now a massive liability, Richard and Patricia turned their panicked eyes toward the only person in the room who held actual power. They turned to me. Richard stumbled forward, bracing his shaking hands on the obsidian table. The arrogance that defined his existence was stripped away. He looked like a broken, terrified old man. "Clara, please." Richard begged, his voice cracking violently. "You are our flesh and blood. You are my daughter. I know we made terrible mistakes. I know we failed you. But you cannot let this happen to us. You cannot let the federal government seize everything I have built. You have the power to fix this right now. You can acquire the debt. You can pay off the tax liens before prosecutors issue indictments. You cannot let us lose the house. You cannot let us go to jail." Patricia rushed to his side, heavy tears streaming down her face. She clasped her hands tightly together, staring at me with pleading eyes. "Please, Clara, have mercy on us. We are your family. We gave you life. You cannot sit in this beautiful office and watch your parents be destroyed. We will do whatever you want. We will apologize publicly. We will make it right. Just sign the bailout papers and save us." I placed my hands flat on the glass table and slowly stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the two people who created me, the people currently begging for their freedom, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no joy, no sadness, no lingering anger. There was only the cold, hard reality of the boundaries I built over 15 years. "You want to talk about flesh and blood?" I stated, my voice echoing with measured precision. "You want to talk about family and mercy? Let us talk about a night 15 years ago. Let us talk about a historic blizzard and a teenage girl with a fever of 102 degrees. Richard flinched violently, his eyes darting toward the floor. Patricia let out a pathetic sob. "You knew I had chronic pneumonia," I continued. "You knew I was physically vulnerable. But when your golden child stole $15,000 and blamed it on me, you did not ask a single question. You did not look at my bank statements. You packed my clothes in a garbage bag and threw me into a winter storm. You locked the door. You turned up the volume on the television. You sat on your leather sofa and drank hot cocoa while you let me freeze to death on the sidewalk. You sacrificed me to protect a thief because it fit your perfect narrative." "Clara, we were wrong." Patricia cried out, tears dripping onto her mink coat. "We are so sorry. We regret it every single day." I held up my hand, silencing her. "Do not insult my intelligence," I commanded. "You did not look for me. You never filed a missing persons report. You legally disowned me to protect your precious assets. And when you found out I was a senior partner at an investment firm today, your first instinct was to manipulate me into paying off your criminal tax debt." I leaned forward, resting my fingertips on their financial autopsy. "You are not sorry you threw me out into the snow, Richard. You are only sorry the girl you tried to kill grew up to hold your execution warrant. An apology forced by bankruptcy is not remorse. It is a negotiation tactic, and I am absolutely not buying it." Richard stared at me. The realization that his emotional manipulation had failed completely finally sank into his panicked mind. He had played his last card. He had tried authority, he had tried logic, and he had tried the pathetic, groveling desperation of a ruined father. None of it penetrated my armor. I watched the last remaining spark of hope extinguish in his eyes. He collapsed back into his chair, a hollow, defeated shell of the arrogant real estate tycoon who had walked into my lobby 30 minutes ago. He was waiting for the final blow. He knew I held his absolute destruction in my hands. I reached for my leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. I did not break eye contact with him as I snapped the metal clasps open. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a sleek black cover. I placed the stack onto the glass table. The heavy thud of the paper echoed in the silent room. This was not a standard corporate bailout agreement. It was the most aggressive, merciless, hostile takeover contract my legal team had ever drafted. I had prepared this document days ago, anticipating the exact moment Richard would realize he had no other way out. "You came here looking for a solution," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying calm. "You wanted Reed Capital to save you from federal prison. You wanted us to pay off the Internal Revenue Service and assume your massive corporate debt. I am going to offer you a way out. I am going to give you exactly what you asked for, but it will be entirely on my terms." Richard lifted his head. His eyes darted toward the black legal binder. "What are the terms?" he whispered. His voice was so raspy and weak it barely carried across the obsidian table. I opened the binder and turned the document so it faced him. "My firm will assume the entirety of your $10 million debt. We will immediately wire the outstanding payroll taxes directly to the federal government, satisfying the liens and effectively terminating the criminal tax evasion investigation against you. You will not go to federal prison. You will not stand trial. You will walk out of this building as a free man." Patricia let out a loud, shuddering breath of relief. She reached out and grabbed Richard's arm, her diamond rings clinking against his suit jacket. "Oh, thank God," she cried out. "Richard, she is saving us. I knew she would not let us go to jail." "I am not finished," I commanded, silencing her instantly. I tapped my manicured finger against the signature line of the contract. "I am saving you from federal prison, Richard. I am not saving your lifestyle. In exchange for absorbing your catastrophic liabilities, you are going to sign over 100% of your company shares to Reed Capital. You will relinquish every commercial property, every development site, and every piece of corporate intellectual property you have ever created. You will step down as Chief Executive Officer immediately." Richard recoiled as if he had been physically struck. "You are taking my entire company. You are stripping me of my life's work." "I am stripping you of your debt," I corrected him sharply. "I am taking the bankrupt, bleeding carcass of a company you destroyed to fund Brittany's shopping addiction. But I am requiring more than just your corporate assets. Your business liabilities far exceed the value of your commercial portfolio. To balance the acquisition, I require personal collateral." I flipped to the second page of the contract. "You will sign over the deed to your primary residence, the family estate in the suburbs. The house you locked me out of 15 years ago will become the sole property of Reed Capital. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Patricia screamed, a raw, visceral shriek of pure horror. "You cannot take my house. You cannot take my home. Where are we supposed to live?" "You can live wherever your remaining personal savings will take you," I replied coldly. "But that estate is no longer yours. It is corporate collateral." Richard shook his head frantically. He gripped the edge of the glass table, trying to find some leverage, some angle to negotiate. "Clara, this is madness. The company and the house are worth millions, even with the debt. You have to compensate me for the equity. You have to offer me a fair buyout price. I will not just hand over my entire existence for free." I looked at him, my expression hardening into absolute stone. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not pull out a company checkbook. I did not pull out a multi-million-dollar bank draft. I pulled out my wallet and retrieved a single crisp $1 bill. I held the bill up to the light, letting them see the face of George Washington. Then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I placed the dollar bill directly on top of the signature line of the hostile takeover contract. "That is your compensation," I announced. "I am offering you exactly $1 for your entire empire." Richard stared at the dollar bill, his mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. He looked from the green paper to my face, waiting for the punchline. When he realized there was no joke, his shock morphed into furious indignation. $1. You expect me to sign away my company, my legacy, and my home for a single piece of paper? This is an insult. This is extortion. I will never sign this. I will take my chances in bankruptcy court. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. Bankruptcy court will not protect you from the federal government, Richard. I checked my watch. It is currently 2 in the afternoon. Jamal's forensic audit is sitting in a secure digital folder on my secure server. It outlines every single fraudulent wire transfer, every synthetic lease, and every stolen payroll tax dollar. It is the definitive roadmap to your federal indictment. I looked him dead in the eye. I am offering you your freedom for $1. You have exactly 3 minutes to sign that contract. If you do not sign it by the time those 3 minutes are up, I will hit send. I will forward Jamal's entire audit directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the federal government. They will have federal agents waiting at your front door before you even make it back to the suburbs. I sat back in my chair and crossed my arms. The clock is ticking. The silence in the boardroom became deafening. Richard stared at the dollar bill. His breathing became incredibly shallow. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. Patricia was sobbing hysterically, grabbing his shoulder, begging him to just sign the paper so they would not be arrested. Brittany sat completely paralyzed, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the destruction she had caused. 1 minute, I announced, my voice cutting through Patricia's crying. Richard reached a trembling hand toward the gold pen he had dropped on the floor earlier. He missed. His fingers were shaking so violently he could not grasp the metal. He fell to his knees on the marble floor, a broken, defeated man scrambling to find the pen. He grabbed it and hauled himself back into his chair. 2 minutes, I stated. He stared at the signature line. A tear slipped down his cheek, splashing onto the crisp white paper of the contract. He was mourning his pride, his status, his entire false identity. But he was fundamentally a coward. He lacked the strength to face the consequences of his own actions. He was terrified of prison. He pressed the gold pen to the paper. His hand shook violently, but he managed to drag the ink across the page. He signed the corporate acquisition. He signed the property deed transfer. He signed his resignation. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the glass table and stopped against the crisp $1 bill. He had signed away his entire life's work for a single dollar to the daughter he had thrown away. The transaction was complete. The empire was mine. I pulled the signed contract across the black obsidian table, stacking the pages with meticulous care. The harsh scratching sound of the paper sliding against glass was the only noise in the boardroom. Richard remained hunched over the table, staring vacantly at the space where his empire used to be. He had traded his entire legacy for a single dollar bill to avoid a federal cage. I picked up the dollar, folded it precisely in half, and slipped it into the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. A souvenir of absolute victory. Beside him, Patricia was finally processing the brutal mechanics of the legal document her husband had just executed. The initial relief of avoiding prison was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the suffocating reality of her new socioeconomic status. The transfer of the deed meant she was no longer the matriarch of a sprawling suburban estate. The loss of the company meant the immediate termination of their corporate accounts. There would be no more luxury cars. There would be no more exclusive country club memberships. The phantom wealth she had weaponized had vanished. Patricia looked down at her mink coat, then at her diamond rings, perhaps calculating how many months of rent those items would cover. Her eyes widened with absolute terror. She was losing her identity. To a woman like Patricia, social status was oxygen, and I had just cut off her air supply. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to somehow reverse the irreversible, but he was completely catatonic. She turned her frantic gaze to Brittany, but the golden child was staring blankly at the floor. Patricia was entirely alone. The sheer panic inside my mother quickly transmuted into raw hatred. Narcissists cannot process defeat as a consequence of their own actions. They must create a villain. Patricia's face flushed a deep mottled red. The carefully maintained facade of the elegant housewife shattered completely, revealing the ugly, bitter core beneath. She slammed her manicured hands against the glass table and pushed herself up. "You planned this from the start," she shrieked, her voice tearing through the sterile air. "You sat out there for 15 years plotting how to steal everything we built. We gave you a roof over your head. We clothed you. We fed you. And you repay us by rendering us homeless. You are taking my house. You are taking my entire life." I did not flinch. I remained perfectly still, watching her unravel. "You built your life on a foundation of stolen payroll taxes and offshore fraud," I corrected her smoothly. "I am simply the one foreclosing on the property." Patricia was beyond logic. She lunged forward, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are sick," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure venom. "You are a sick, vindictive girl. You have always been broken. You were a broken, defective child, and you are a broken, psychotic woman. You are destroying your own flesh and blood out of malice. You are a monster." I let her words hang in the air. I let the echo of her hatred bounce off the soundproof glass walls. 15 years ago, those words would have crushed me. I would have internalized her cruelty and believed I was exactly the defective burden she claimed I was. But standing in my boardroom, cloaked in absolute financial independence, her insults were completely powerless. They were just the desperate noises of a bankrupt fraud realizing she had lost. I stood up slowly, ensuring my posture projected total dominance. I locked my eyes directly onto hers. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the chilling, calculated precision of an executioner delivering a final sentence. "Get out," I stated, enunciating every single syllable perfectly. "I do not need a sick family." Patricia physically recoiled as if she had been slapped. She recognized the words instantly, the exact phrase Richard had spat at me before they threw my clothes onto the frozen porch. The very sentence that defined my expulsion into the blizzard. I had kept those words locked in a vault inside my mind for a decade and a half, waiting for the precise moment to hand them back. The poetry of the moment was absolute. I reached across my mahogany desk and pressed the discreet silver button located under the rim. The security protocol initiated immediately. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. 4 corporate security officers entered the room. They were massive, silent professionals dressed in dark suits trained to handle hostile corporate evictions without a shred of hesitation. "Escort these 3 individuals out of the building," I instructed the lead officer, my tone strictly business. "They are no longer permitted on the premises. Ensure they surrender their temporary visitor badges at the front desk." The lead officer nodded sharply. He approached Richard, grabbing him firmly by the upper arm. Richard did not fight back. He allowed himself to be hauled to his feet, shuffling toward the door like a sleepwalker. Brittany remained paralyzed until 2 officers flanked her, forcing her to stand. She grabbed her designer handbag, clutching it to her chest like a shield, and let them march her out of the room. She kept her eyes glued to the marble floor, utterly destroyed. Patricia, however, refused to go quietly. When the final security officer grabbed her elbow, she thrashed wildly, attempting to break free. "Do not touch me," she screamed. "I am a respectable woman. You cannot treat me like a criminal. Clara, call them off right now. You will regret this. You will burn in hell for what you are doing." Jamal and I watched them leave. The officer tightened his grip, hauling her toward the exit. Her heels scraped against the polished stone. The heavy glass doors hissed shut, locking perfectly. We were entirely unbothered. The execution was complete, leaving no room for regret. I had truly won this final battle. 6 months passed. In the corporate world, 6 months is 2 fiscal quarters. It is more than enough time to dissolve an empire, liquidate assets, and redistribute wealth. For my biological family, those 2 quarters were a masterclass in the ruthless physics of financial gravity. What goes up on highly leveraged credit must inevitably come crashing down in spectacular, agonizing ruin. The ink on the hostile takeover contract dried the Internal Revenue Service, received their wired funds, and the Reed Capital Asset Management team dismantled Richard's company down to the studs. I did not oversee the liquidation personally. I handed the file to a junior associate because they were no longer worth my billable hours. The fallout was not poetic. It was strictly mathematically logical. Richard avoided a federal penitentiary because I paid his tax debt, but he could not avoid the devastation of his reputation. When the Boston business community learned that he had signed his entire commercial portfolio away for a single dollar to avoid federal indictment, he became a pariah. No bank would lend to him. No developer would partner with him. Stripped of his company and his suburban estate, Richard was forced to enter the actual workforce at 60 years old with a ruined resume and zero marketable leverage. Today, the former real estate tycoon is a shift manager at a big box hardware store in a rundown strip mall. He wears a stiff polyester vest with a plastic name tag pinned over his heart. Instead of negotiating multi-million-dollar mezzanine loans in glass boardrooms, he spends his days arguing with disgruntled contractors about return policies on defective power tools. He clocks in at 6 in the morning, stands on his feet for 10 grueling hours on solid concrete floors, and takes his lunch break in a windowless room, smelling of bleach and cheap microwave meals. There are no corporate expense accounts or golf afternoons. There is only the bleak minimum wage reality he once mocked. Patricia's descent was equally absolute. Her entire identity was built on proximity to wealth. When the mansion was foreclosed and the luxury cars were repossessed by relentless creditors, her social circle evaporated overnight. Country club friendships are strictly transactional, and Patricia no longer had the financial currency to participate. When the whispers of her husband's tax evasion and her daughter's embezzlement spread through the elite social scene, her wealthy friends severed all contact. They stopped inviting her to charity galas. They blocked her number. They treated her like a financial contagion. The grand illusion of superiority she had spent decades curating dissolved into nothingness, leaving her entirely exposed. She now lives alone in a cramped ground-floor apartment in a noisy working-class neighborhood far outside the city limits. The vaulted ceilings and custom marble countertops of her past have been replaced by peeling linoleum floors and thin drywall that rattles every time a garbage truck drives past. She has no cleaning staff. She has no personal gardeners. She spends her days sitting in a tiny living room filled with the few cheap pieces of furniture she could afford from a discount store, completely isolated from the world she used to rule. The woman who once threw her sick daughter into a freezing blizzard to protect her public image now has no public image left to protect. She is a ghost haunting her own ruined life. But the most precise application of karma was reserved for Brittany. The golden child finally faced a judge who could not be manipulated by fake tears or therapy buzzwords. During the brutal divorce proceedings, Jamal submitted the forensic audit, documenting her felony wire fraud and the theft of their children's college savings. Family court judges have zero tolerance for financial predators who steal from their own offspring. Jamal was granted sole physical and legal custody immediately. Brittany was granted heavily monitored supervised visitation, which she can barely afford to utilize due to the strict legal fees associated with court-appointed monitors. The judge did not stop at custody. Brittany was ordered to pay full financial restitution to Jamal to rebuild the drained savings plans. Without her father's company to siphon money from and completely cut off from Jamal's lucrative salary, Brittany was forced to face the real world with absolutely no marketable skills. She currently lives in a cheap, poorly heated rental unit on the industrial outskirts of the city. To comply with the court-ordered restitution and avoid jail time for the fraud, she works a grueling minimum wage job at a fast food franchise. A significant percentage of her meager paycheck is automatically garnished by the state and transferred directly into Jamal's accounts before she ever sees a dime. The woman who casually dropped $25,000 on a designer handbag now wears a greasy uniform and counts out exact change for drive-through customers. They tried to reach out, of course. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of delusion. Over the past 6 months, a slow trickle of letters has arrived at the reception desk of Reed Capital. The envelopes are thin and cheap, the handwriting shaky and desperate. They beg for forgiveness. They plead for a second chance. They ask for just a small financial loan to help them get back on their feet quickly, promising that things will be different this time, that they have finally learned their lesson and changed their ways forever. I do not read them. I do not feel guilt, pity, or curiosity. I simply take a thick black marker, draw a heavy dark line across their names, and write "Return to Sender" in bold capital letters. I hand them back to the mailroom clerk without a second thought. The boundary I built is a fortress of solid steel. There will be no reconciliation. There will be no rescue. They are reaping the exact harvest they planted 15 years ago, and I am far too busy running an empire to ever look back. The snow was falling steadily over the Boston skyline, a gentle rhythmic dusting of white that blanketed the city in a serene, peaceful glow. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, a steaming mug of spiced apple cider warming my hands. I watched the snowflakes dance against the reinforced soundproof glass. 15 years ago, a winter storm exactly like this one had nearly ended my life. I was a sick, terrified teenager locked out in the freezing darkness by the people who were biologically obligated to protect me. Tonight, I was watching the snow fall from the absolute warmth of a $50 million sanctuary that I owned free and clear. The contrast was not just poetic. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of my absolute victory over their toxicity. The rich scent of roasted rosemary, sage, and caramelized butter drifted through the expansive open-concept living space. I turned away from the winter skyline and looked at my dining room. The custom-cut mahogany table was set for 5. Fine crystal glasses sparkled under the warm amber glow of the modern chandelier overhead. There was no tension in the air. There were no calculated performances, no hidden resentments, and no toxic expectations waiting to be weaponized. There was only the sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter echoing off the high ceilings. At the head of the table stood Donovan Reed, the ruthless billionaire investment tycoon who routinely terrified Wall Street executives. Was currently wearing a beige linen apron over his tailored dress shirt, meticulously carving a massive Thanksgiving turkey. He wielded the carving knife with the exact same lethal precision he used to dissect corporate merger contracts. He looked up, caught me watching him from across the room, and smiled. It was a warm, incredibly proud smile. Donovan was not just my mentor or my superior at the firm. He was the man who had pulled me out of a freezing snowbank and taught me how to conquer the world. He was the father I actually deserved. He had given me the tools to build my impenetrable armor, but more importantly, he had shown me what genuine, unconditional support looked like. "Pass the cranberry sauce, Uncle Donovan," a bright, cheerful voice rang out across the room. I smiled broadly as Jamal's 7-year-old son reached his hand across the table. Donovan immediately obliged, playfully ruffling the young boy's hair before placing a generous slice of roasted white meat directly onto his porcelain plate. Sitting next to the boy was his younger sister, happily swinging her legs beneath her tall chair and coloring intensely on a paper placemat we had set out specifically for her. They were safe, entirely secure, and completely insulated from the financial and emotional destruction their biological mother had tried to inflict upon their lives. Jamal sat across from Donovan, pouring a glass of sparkling cider for his daughter. The transformation in Jamal over the past 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. The heavy, exhausted dark bags under his eyes were completely gone. The rigid, stress-induced posture that used to define his presence had melted away entirely. He looked vibrant, healthy, and incredibly at peace with his reality. Without the suffocating weight of Brittany's endless credit card debt and narcissistic manipulation dragging him down into ruin, Jamal had flourished remarkably. He was recently promoted to managing director of our corporate auditing division, a title he earned through pure, unadulterated brilliance and flawless work ethic. He was no longer a man desperately trying to bail out a sinking ship while his wife drilled holes in the hull. He was a successful father providing a magnificent, perfectly stable life for his 2 children. We were a profoundly strange collection of people, an aging billionaire titan, a ruthless mergers and acquisitions partner, and a brilliant single father with 2 young kids. We did not share a single drop of DNA. We did not share a common ancestry or a traditional family tree mapped out in a photo album. Yet sitting around that mahogany table passing heavy ceramic plates of warm food and sharing light-hearted stories about our week at the firm, I knew with absolute certainty that this was the truest family I had ever known. I took my seat at the table sitting directly across from Jamal and to the right of Donovan. Jamal raised his crystal glass, tapping it gently against mine with a clear ringing chime. "To a phenomenal year, Clara." Jamal said, his eyes reflecting a deep, unspoken gratitude for the brutal battle we had fought and won together in that glass boardroom. "To impenetrable fortresses," I replied smoothly, returning his toast and taking a sip. As we ate the magnificent meal, I listened to the lively chatter and felt a profound sense of permanent closure settle over my mind. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was not analyzing a threat or scanning a corporate balance sheet for anomalies. I was simply present. I looked at the people sitting around my table and realized the most important lesson the universe had ever taught me. Society aggressively conditions us to believe that blood is a sacred bond, an unbreakable covenant that demands our endless sacrifice and silent suffering. We are constantly told to forgive the unforgivable simply because the person intentionally hurting us happens to share our genetic code. But that is a toxic lie designed to keep victims tethered securely to their abusers. Blood does not make you a family. Blood is just a biological starting point, a roll of the genetic dice. True family is defined entirely by loyalty, unshakable integrity, and mutual respect. Family is the person who pulls over their armored vehicle in a deadly blizzard to save a complete stranger. Family is the professional colleague who stands shoulder to shoulder with you in a glass boardroom to expose a massive fraud, risking his own heart to do the morally right thing. Family is not the people who lock you out in the raging storm to freeze to death to protect their reputation. Family is the people who hold the umbrella over your head when the rain starts falling. My biological parents and my sister chose the shallow illusion of status over the reality of love. They worshipped money above all else, so I simply used money to systematically dismantle their entire existence. I learned that financial independence is not just about buying expensive things or living in luxury penthouses overlooking the city. Financial independence is the ultimate boundary. It is the absolute unshakable power to walk away from toxicity without ever having to look back. It is the ability to look your abusers dead in the eye and permanently deny them any access to your peace. I built a massive corporate empire to ensure I would never be a victim again, and in the process of protecting myself, I found the beautiful family I was always meant to have. Have you ever had to use your success to crush the people who doubted you? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more stories of setting boundaries and taking back your power. The story of Clara powerfully dismantles the societal myth that sharing DNA automatically equates to a loving, supportive family. From a young age, we are frequently conditioned to believe that blood is a sacred, unbreakable covenant that demands our endless sacrifice and silent suffering. However, Clara's harrowing experience of being locked out in a deadly winter storm by her own parents vividly proves that biological ties can sometimes be the most destructive forces in our lives. The most profound lesson to draw from this narrative is that true family is entirely defined by loyalty, unshakable integrity, and mutual respect. Healing truly begins when we stop waiting for toxic people to change and instead focus on building our own sanctuaries. Clara found her genuine family, not in her childhood home, but in Donovan the mentor, who pulled her from the freezing snow, and Jamal, the colleague who bravely stood by her to expose the truth. These individuals represent the people who choose to hold the umbrella over your head during the storm, rather than those who purposefully lock you out in the cold. Furthermore, the narrative highlights a critical truth about self-preservation. Financial and emotional independence serve as the ultimate boundaries against abuse. Independence is not merely about acquiring wealth or luxury. It is the absolute power to walk away from toxicity without ever having to look back. It grants us the undeniable strength to look our abusers in the eye and permanently deny them access to our peace. We all deserve a support system that values us unconditionally, free from manipulation, cruelty, and guilt. Take a moment today to evaluate your own personal boundaries and start investing your energy only into the chosen family who truly respect, protect, and uplift you.